Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into ancient Rome, a world of marble temples, crowded streets, ambitious politicians, and enough bureaucracy to make a modern tax office seem refreshingly straightforward. So before we begin, take a moment, like the video, and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always interesting to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan or AC for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. If you were fortunate enough to become an imperial librarian in ancient Rome, you had discovered one of the closest things the ancient world offered to a comfortable office job. While millions of Romans spent their days farming, hauling cargo through busy ports, marching with legions across distant frontiers, or arguing loudly in marketplaces over the price of fish, you spent your working hours surrounded by books. Well, scrolls. Thousands and thousands of scrolls. The Romans had not yet invented books as we know them today, which meant every piece of knowledge worth preserving existed as a long roll of papyrus that had to be carefully stored, organized, protected, and occasionally rescued from someone who had absolutely no idea where they had put it. Ancient Rome loved knowledge almost as much as it loved conquering things. Sometimes the two activities happened at the same time. Roman generals would march into foreign cities, win a battle, and then immediately start collecting libraries. To the Romans, capturing a famous collection of books was almost as satisfying as capturing gold. Someone, naturally, had to keep track of all these scrolls. That someone was often you. As an imperial librarian, your responsibilities included organizing collections, supervising scribes, assisting scholars, maintaining records, and ensuring that priceless manuscripts did not mysteriously vanish. This last task proved surprisingly important because wealthy Romans had a habit of borrowing scrolls and occasionally forgetting to return them. Human nature, it turns out, has changed very little over the last 2,000 years. Imagine trying to run a library where every single book had been copied by hand. There were no printing presses. No digital catalogs. No search bars. If a senator wanted a speech delivered 60 years earlier by a politician whose name he couldn't quite remember, finding it often depended entirely upon your memory. Somewhere in the building sat the scroll he needed. Probably. Hopefully. Assuming nobody had placed it on the wrong shelf. Or left it in a reading room. Or allowed a hungry mouse to take an unexpected interest in Roman literature. Fortunately, compared with most Roman occupations, these were relatively pleasant problems to solve. The average Roman laborer spent long hours carrying heavy materials under the Mediterranean sun. Construction workers hauled stone blocks. Sailors battled storms. Soldiers marched hundreds of miles carrying equipment that seemed specifically designed to make walking uncomfortable. You, meanwhile, spent much of your day in cool marble halls discussing philosophy, history, and literature with some of the most educated people in the empire. Frankly, it was a very different experience. Many Roman libraries were magnificent structures. Tall columns surrounded quiet reading rooms. Statues of famous thinkers watched silently over visitors. Gardens provided peaceful places for reflection. Wealthy patrons donated money to expand collections, eager to prove they appreciated culture almost as much as they appreciated being seen appreciating culture. As librarian, you occupied a respected position within this world of learning. Scholars knew your name. Writers valued your assistance. Government officials occasionally relied upon your expertise. Even emperors sometimes took an interest in important collections. Most Romans would never come close to speaking with the intellectual elite of the empire. You might spend an entire afternoon helping them locate a particular manuscript. Of course, the job wasn't completely stress-free. Fire remained the great enemy of every library. A single overturned lamp could destroy centuries of knowledge in one terrible evening. Librarians became remarkably attentive whenever flames appeared anywhere near a scroll. If somebody walked into your library carrying a torch, your heart probably began beating much faster than usual. There were also the scribes. Libraries depended upon teams of professional copyists who reproduced manuscripts by hand. Some worked quickly. Some worked carefully. Very few managed both at the same time. Supervising them required patience, diplomacy, and occasional resistance to the urge to scream when discovering an expensive copying mistake halfway through a document. Still, compared with the alternatives available to most Romans, life remained extraordinarily comfortable. The average worker worried about harvests, wages, disease, and whether tomorrow's labor would be any easier than today's. You worried about cataloging scrolls. One of these concerns was noticeably preferable to the other. In an empire famous for military conquest and political ambition, becoming an imperial librarian offered something surprisingly rare. Stability. Respect. Comfort. And the opportunity to spend your days surrounded by humanity's accumulated knowledge rather than being ordered to carry heavy objects from one location to another for reasons that seemed perfectly clear to your supervisor and absolutely nobody else. Not a bad arrangement for ancient Rome. Still, while librarians spent their days preserving knowledge, another fortunate Roman spent his days accumulating something even more useful in Roman society. Money. Because few careers offered greater opportunities for wealth than becoming a successful merchant trader. If you were fortunate enough to become a wealthy merchant trader in ancient Rome, you had discovered one of the closest things the ancient world offered to a golden ticket. While countless Romans spent their lives working the same fields year after year, hoping the weather remained cooperative and the harvest did not disappoint, you lived in a world of opportunity that stretched from the misty shores of Britain to the deserts of Egypt. The Roman Empire was enormous. Modern maps sometimes struggle to capture just how large it really was. At its height, Rome controlled territory across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. Thousands of miles of roads connected distant provinces. Merchant ships crossed the Mediterranean constantly. Goods flowed in every direction. Wealth flowed in every direction as well, although experienced merchants generally preferred it flowing toward them. This was where you came in. Your job, at least in theory, was wonderfully simple. Buy something where it was cheap. Transport it somewhere else. Sell it where it was expensive. Become rich. Unfortunately, reality occasionally introduced complications. Those complications included storms, pirates, dishonest partners, corrupt officials, shipwrecks, bandits, unpredictable markets, and customers who somehow believed your prices should be lower despite having no intention of carrying several tons of cargo across the Mediterranean themselves. Commerce has always possessed certain challenges. Still, compared with the average Roman occupation, the rewards could be extraordinary. A successful merchant trader might accumulate a fortune large enough to purchase elegant homes, sponsor public buildings, host lavish banquets, and enjoy a lifestyle that many senators secretly envied. This occasionally created awkward situations. Roman society officially admired military achievement, political service, and noble ancestry. Unofficially, it also admired money. Lots of money. The sort of money that allowed a man to import exotic spices from India simply because he preferred his dinner slightly more flavorful than everyone else's. As a merchant trader, your days rarely looked the same. One morning might find you standing on the docks of Ostia, Rome's great harbor city. The air smelled of seawater, fish, tar, wet rope, olive oil, and several other scents that nobody had ever successfully bottled as a luxury fragrance. Around you, hundreds of workers moved cargo from ships arriving from every corner of the empire. Sailors shouted instructions. Dock workers carried crates. Officials inspected paperwork. Animals protested loudly against their employment conditions. The entire harbor seemed alive with movement. Some ships arrived carrying Egyptian grain. Others brought Spanish silver. Still others unloaded African olive oil, Greek wine, Eastern spices, fine glassware, luxury textiles, and countless products that had traveled thousands of miles before finally reaching Roman markets. Every crate represented opportunity. Every shipment represented profit. At least, that was the hope. A merchant quickly learned that optimism and mathematics needed to work together. Buying goods required careful calculation. Transporting them required even more. You needed to understand supply and demand, seasonal changes, transportation costs, local politics, market trends, weather patterns, and human behavior. Particularly human behavior. People have always been remarkably inventive when attempting to avoid paying full price. Roman customers were no exception. A wealthy merchant therefore spent a great deal of time negotiating. Some negotiations lasted minutes. Others lasted hours. A few seemed capable of lasting generations. The Romans approached bargaining with considerable enthusiasm. A simple discussion regarding the price of wine could evolve into a philosophical debate, a family history, 3 personal insults, and eventually a business agreement. Experienced traders learned patience. They also learned that whoever appeared least eager often gained the advantage. This occasionally resulted in 2 merchants pretending not to care about a transaction that both desperately wanted to complete. From a distance, it probably looked ridiculous. Fortunately, profit has a way of making people overlook absurdity. The greatest advantage of the profession was freedom. Most Romans remained tied to a particular place throughout their lives. Farmers worked local land. Craftsmen operated local workshops. Laborers sought local employment. Merchants traveled. A successful trader might visit Alexandria, Antioch, Carthage, Athens, Ephesus, Massilia, and dozens of other cities spread across the empire. Each possessed its own culture, customs, foods, accents, fashions, and opportunities. The ancient world became your workplace. Of course, travel in ancient Rome was not always comfortable. Modern tourists occasionally complain when their flight is delayed for an hour. Roman merchants sometimes disappeared into storms for weeks. Perspective is useful. Sea travel remained the fastest method of transportation, but it required considerable courage. Mediterranean weather could change rapidly. Calm waters occasionally transformed into violent storms with alarming speed. When this happened, passengers generally became very interested in religion. Even individuals who had shown little spiritual enthusiasm before departure often discovered a sudden desire to pray. The sea possessed a remarkable ability to encourage faith. Yet despite these risks, merchants continued sailing because the rewards were simply too attractive. A single successful voyage might generate enough profit to transform a man's fortunes. And unlike many careers in ancient Rome, success depended more upon intelligence and judgment than physical strength. That alone made the profession appealing. While soldiers marched beneath heavy armor and laborers carried enormous loads, you earned money through decisions. Good decisions, admittedly. Bad decisions remained expensive. But there was something undeniably satisfying about building wealth through knowledge, planning, and experience rather than pure physical effort. And if fortune smiled upon you, those decisions could eventually make you one of the wealthiest men in the empire. And if fortune smiled upon you, those decisions could eventually make you one of the wealthiest men in the empire. The interesting thing about becoming a successful merchant was that money itself wasn't actually the most valuable thing you possessed. Gold was useful, certainly. Romans liked gold. Most human beings throughout history have liked gold. But experienced merchants quickly learned that relationships were often worth far more than coins. A chest full of money could buy cargo. A trusted contact in Alexandria could make you rich for decades. The Roman Empire ran on connections. Roads connected cities. Ships connected provinces. Trade connected markets. People connected everything else. If you wanted to become truly successful, you needed to know people. Lots of people. Preferably honest people, although Roman merchants often discovered that this requirement significantly reduced the available options. At first your network might be small. Perhaps you knew a wine producer in southern Gaul. Maybe an olive oil merchant in North Africa. A ship captain who reliably transported cargo without accidentally losing half of it into the Mediterranean. A warehouse owner who charged reasonable rates. A money lender who didn't immediately begin calculating how much of your future fortune he intended to acquire. These relationships became the foundation of your business. The remarkable thing about trade was that every successful transaction tended to create another opportunity. One merchant introduced you to another. One shipment led to a larger shipment. One profitable agreement opened doors that had previously remained closed. Before long, you found yourself exchanging letters with people living hundreds or even thousands of miles away. This sounds perfectly ordinary today. In ancient Rome it was rather impressive. Imagine conducting business with someone you might only meet once every few years. Months could pass between letters. News traveled slowly. Information traveled slowly. Everything traveled slowly except taxes, which somehow always seemed capable of arriving exactly on schedule. A merchant therefore learned patience. You had to. There was no alternative. If you sent a cargo ship from Egypt to Italy, you couldn't spend the next several weeks constantly checking its location. There was no helpful map showing its progress. There was no captain sending updates. There was simply waiting. Lots and lots of waiting. Somewhere beyond the horizon your investment was floating across the sea, and all you could really do was hope that the weather remained cooperative and nobody developed an interest in piracy. This uncertainty made reliable contacts incredibly valuable. A trustworthy business partner reduced risk. A competent agent could monitor local prices, arrange purchases, negotiate contracts, and send reports. If grain prices suddenly rose in Rome, somebody needed to tell you. If olive oil production suffered in North Africa, somebody needed to tell you. If a local governor introduced new regulations complicated enough to make merchants groan audibly across an entire province, somebody definitely needed to tell you. Information was money. In some cases it was more valuable than the cargo itself. Knowing what would happen next allowed you to prepare before everyone else. A merchant who learned about a shortage before his competitors often made a great deal of money. A merchant who learned about it after everyone else generally spent his time wondering why he hadn't received the information sooner. Of course, gathering information required talking to people. Roman merchants spent an astonishing amount of time talking to people. Business meetings. Dinners. Banquets. Social gatherings. Conversations in markets. Conversations in harbors. Conversations while waiting for ships. Conversations while discussing other conversations. If somebody had useful information, you wanted to hear it. Fortunately, Romans enjoyed talking. They enjoyed talking so much that modern historians occasionally suspect the entire empire was held together through sheer conversational momentum. Senators talked. Philosophers talked. Merchants talked. Customers talked. Sometimes everybody talked at once. A busy Roman marketplace could generate enough noise to convince an unsuspecting visitor that several hundred arguments were taking place simultaneously. Quite often, they were. Still, this constant interaction created opportunities. The more people knew you, the more opportunities appeared. Reputation became one of your most valuable assets. If you were known for keeping your word, paying debts, honoring agreements, and delivering cargo on time, business became easier. People trusted you. Trust generated partnerships. Partnerships generated profits. Profits generated additional partnerships. The cycle had a pleasing tendency to continue. Naturally, maintaining a reputation required effort. Every merchant occasionally faced temptation. A particularly profitable deal might encourage someone to bend the rules. A struggling business partner might delay payment. A dishonest trader might disappear entirely. Ancient Rome contained no shortage of creative financial behavior. The challenge was surviving long enough to become known as reliable. Once that happened, opportunities multiplied. Wealthy investors wanted to work with you. Ship captains prioritized your cargo. Suppliers offered better terms. Even local officials often treated successful merchants with a degree of respect. Not necessarily because they admired commerce. More because successful commerce generated taxes, and Roman officials possessed a deep and enduring appreciation for tax revenue. As the years passed, your network stretched farther across the empire. Cities that once seemed distant became familiar. Names that had once appeared on maps became people you knew personally. Alexandria, Carthage, Antioch, Ephesus, Massilia, Tarraco. Each city contained contacts, opportunities, and relationships that strengthened your position. The empire itself gradually transformed from an enormous collection of provinces into something resembling a giant business network. And the larger your network became, the larger your ambitions became. Because once you had reliable partners scattered across the Roman world, a merchant began thinking less about individual transactions and more about entire fleets of ships moving goods from one end of the Mediterranean to the other. Unfortunately, this also meant placing an enormous amount of trust in the sea, which had a long and distinguished history of ignoring even the most carefully prepared business plans. And the larger your network became, the larger your ambitions became. Because once you had reliable partners scattered across the Roman world, a merchant began thinking less about individual transactions and more about entire fleets of ships moving goods from one end of the Mediterranean to the other. Unfortunately, this also meant placing an enormous amount of trust in the sea, which had a long and distinguished history of ignoring even the most carefully prepared business plans. For all the impressive roads Rome constructed, sea travel remained the true backbone of long-distance commerce. Moving cargo by ship was faster, cheaper, and considerably less exhausting than attempting to transport thousands of pounds of merchandise across hundreds of miles of rough terrain. A single merchant vessel could carry more goods than countless wagons. The Romans understood this perfectly well. That is why the Mediterranean constantly buzzed with activity. If you were a wealthy merchant trader, much of your life revolved around ports. Ports were where fortunes arrived. Ports were where fortunes departed. And occasionally, ports were where fortunes disappeared entirely. A typical morning in a major Roman harbor began long before sunrise. Sailors moved through the darkness carrying lanterns. Dockworkers prepared equipment. Warehouse managers inspected incoming cargo. Officials checked records. Traders gathered to discuss prices, rumors, opportunities, and whatever scandal currently entertained the local population. The air carried a mixture of smells that nobody would ever market as a luxury fragrance. Salt water, fish, tar, wet rope, olive oil, livestock, sweat, and the unmistakable scent of hundreds of people attempting to conduct business at the same time. Yet to an experienced merchant, these smells represented opportunity. Every arriving ship carried potential profits. As vessels entered the harbor, activity intensified. Crews shouted instructions. Dockworkers hurried into position. Merchants scanned the arriving cargo with the concentration of people trying to determine whether they were about to become richer or significantly more worried. Some ships arrived from Egypt carrying grain. Others brought wine from Gaul. Still others delivered marble, metals, spices, textiles, perfumes, glassware, and luxury goods from distant regions. The Roman world seemed to pour itself into these ports every day. As a merchant, your first task was usually inspection. You wanted to know whether your cargo had survived the journey. This sounds straightforward. It often wasn't. The sea had a remarkable talent for creating surprises. A shipment of wine might arrive intact. A shipment of olive oil might arrive damaged. A shipment of expensive textiles might arrive soaked. And occasionally, a shipment might not arrive at all. This final possibility tended to attract the most attention. Every merchant feared storms. Mediterranean waters often appeared calm and inviting. Under favorable conditions, a voyage could be surprisingly pleasant. Blue skies stretched overhead. Gentle winds filled the sails. The coastline drifted peacefully past in the distance. Then conditions changed. Ancient sailors possessed no modern weather forecasts. There was no helpful warning system informing them that disaster was approaching. Storms simply appeared. One moment the sea seemed friendly. The next moment it seemed determined to destroy everyone aboard. When this happened, cargo became considerably less important than survival. Merchants learned to accept this reality. A shipment could be replaced. People could not. At least not easily. Of course, storms were only one concern. There were also pirates. Every era of Mediterranean history appears to include individuals who looked at honest commerce and concluded that stealing somebody else's cargo sounded much easier. The Romans spent enormous effort suppressing piracy, but pirates displayed an irritating tendency to continue existing. This was particularly unfortunate for merchants. Imagine investing a substantial portion of your fortune in a shipment of luxury goods only to discover that armed strangers had developed an interest in acquiring them without payment. It was difficult to view such situations positively. Fortunately, by the height of the empire, Roman naval power had reduced many of the dangers. Major trade routes became relatively secure. Relatively, however, is doing a great deal of work in that sentence. The sea remained unpredictable. Still, despite these risks, merchants continued sailing because the rewards were extraordinary. And there truly were rewards. When your ship arrived safely after a successful voyage, the feeling was difficult to match. Weeks or months of planning suddenly transformed into tangible profit. Warehouses filled. Contracts were completed. Customers received their goods. Money changed hands. Everyone appeared pleased. At least until the next negotiation began. Roman ports themselves were fascinating places. Take Ostia, for example. The great harbor serving Rome handled enormous quantities of cargo every year. Ships crowded the docks. Warehouses stretched across the landscape. Workers moved constantly between vessels and storage facilities. Traders from different regions mingled together. Languages from across the empire could be heard in every direction. If you stood quietly for a few moments, you could observe much of the Roman world without ever leaving the harbor. A merchant from Egypt might negotiate with a buyer from Spain. A sailor from Greece might unload cargo destined for Britain. A trader from North Africa might discuss prices with a Roman banker. The empire became visible in these interactions. Commerce connected people who otherwise would never have met. It also connected cultures. As a wealthy merchant, travel exposed you to experiences unavailable to most Romans. You visited distant cities. Sampled unfamiliar foods. Encountered new customs. Heard stories from travelers arriving from places so far away that many citizens considered them almost mythical. Some merchants developed a genuine appreciation for these experiences. Others merely wanted to know whether there was money to be made. Both approaches proved surprisingly effective. There was also a certain freedom associated with life around ports. While many Romans spent their entire lives within a relatively small area, merchants moved constantly. New cities appeared on the horizon. New opportunities emerged. New relationships formed. Every voyage offered possibilities. Not every possibility was good, admittedly. But possibilities nonetheless. Of course, constant travel created challenges of its own. Family members often remained behind for extended periods. Business demanded attention. Voyages could last weeks or months. Communication remained slow. A merchant learned to balance ambition with absence. Many succeeded. Some struggled. Such was the nature of a profession tied to movement. Yet despite the occasional hardship, most merchants considered the arrangement worthwhile. They enjoyed wealth. They enjoyed influence. They enjoyed opportunities unavailable to ordinary citizens. And perhaps most importantly, they enjoyed the feeling of standing on a busy dock, watching a heavily loaded ship arrive safely after a long voyage, knowing that somewhere inside that cargo sat the latest addition to an already growing fortune. It was a satisfying sight. Especially because successful merchants quickly discovered that wealth brought far more than comfortable finances. Wealth brought status, luxury, influence, admiration, envy, and a lifestyle that many Romans could only dream about. Because once your trading empire began producing serious profits, life changed in ways that would have seemed almost unimaginable when you first stepped onto the docks as an ambitious young trader. It was a satisfying sight. Especially because successful merchants quickly discovered that wealth brought something far more enjoyable than a profitable shipment arriving safely in port. It brought comfort. Real comfort. And comfort was surprisingly rare in the ancient world. Think about it for a moment. The average Roman woke up every morning wondering how much work needed doing. Farmers worried about crops. Laborers worried about wages. Soldiers worried about being sent somewhere unpleasant, which in Roman military terms could describe a significant portion of the known world. You worried about entirely different things. For example, should you purchase another villa? This was, objectively speaking, a much nicer problem. A successful merchant could afford a home that would have looked astonishing to most ordinary Romans. Not a cramped apartment squeezed above noisy streets where neighbors argued through walls thin enough to make privacy feel like an ambitious rumor. No. You could own a spacious house filled with mosaics, courtyards, fountains, gardens, servants, and enough decorative marble to convince visitors that you had personally conquered a small province. Did you need that much marble? Probably not. Would that stop you? Absolutely not. The Romans loved displaying success. And honestly, can you blame them? If you had spent 20 years building a trading empire across the Mediterranean, surviving storms, negotiating contracts, and somehow managing not to be robbed by every dishonest businessman you encountered, wouldn't you want people to know about it? Of course you would. That is why wealthy Romans filled their homes with expensive objects. Beautiful statues. Imported furniture. Paintings. Luxury textiles. Silver tableware. Exotic decorations from distant provinces. Every item told a story. Sometimes the story was, I appreciate fine craftsmanship. More often the story was, look how much money I have. Visitors generally understood both messages. Then there were the dinners. Roman elites adored dinner parties. Not small dinners. Not sensible dinners. Large dinners. Complicated dinners. Dinners that lasted so long modern restaurant staff would have started turning chairs upside down around them. As a wealthy merchant, you were expected to participate. Imagine entering a dining room illuminated by dozens of lamps. Servants moved quietly between guests. Wine flowed continuously. Platters of food appeared one after another. Conversations drifted from politics to philosophy to business opportunities and then somehow back to politics again. Would everybody be impressed by your success? Hopefully. Would some people secretly envy you? Almost certainly. This was another advantage of becoming wealthy. People paid attention. The son of a farmer might spend his entire life unnoticed by powerful individuals. A successful merchant, however, could find himself dining beside senators, magistrates, and influential citizens whose decisions shaped entire provinces. Not because you were born into privilege. Because you earned it. Well. Mostly. Ancient Rome still appreciated good family connections. But money had a remarkable ability to improve people's opinion of your background. Funny how that works. You also gained something that many Romans desperately wanted. Freedom from uncertainty. Now, was your life completely free of risk? Of course not. You were still a merchant. The sea remained unpredictable. Markets changed. Ships sank. Business partners occasionally developed creative interpretations of honesty. But compared to the average Roman laborer, your situation looked remarkably secure. When harvests failed, farmers suffered. When construction projects ended, workers lost income. When military campaigns went badly, soldiers paid the price. You, meanwhile, probably had investments in several provinces, warehouses filled with goods, and enough savings to survive difficulties that would devastate ordinary families. That kind of security was worth almost as much as the money itself. And perhaps the greatest luxury of all was time. Think about how rare that was. Most people spent nearly every waking hour working. You could delegate responsibilities. Agents handled transactions. Managers supervised warehouses. Captains oversaw ships. Servants maintained properties. The larger your business became, the less involved you needed to be in every small detail. Imagine that. Building a business so successful that other people handled the stressful parts. The dream has not changed much in 2,000 years. Of course, this freedom created a new challenge. What exactly were you supposed to do with all your spare time? Roman merchants discovered many answers to that question. Some pursued politics, sponsored public buildings, funded temples, collected art, traveled. And some simply enjoyed the pleasant experience of sitting in a beautiful garden while somebody else worried about moving cargo across the Mediterranean. Frankly, after years spent building a fortune, that last option sounds entirely reasonable. Frankly, after years spent building a fortune, sitting comfortably in a villa while somebody else worried about cargo sounded like a very sensible reward. The trouble was that cargo had an unfortunate habit of refusing to transport itself. Every coin you earned, every contract you signed, every expensive dinner you attended eventually depended upon ships crossing the Mediterranean, and that meant placing a remarkable amount of trust in sailors, weather, and pure luck. Now, sailors at least could be questioned. Weather was much less cooperative. Have you ever noticed how confidently people discuss the weather despite having absolutely no authority over it? Roman merchants were no different. Before every voyage somebody would claim the conditions looked perfect. Then 3 days later a storm would appear and everybody would suddenly become philosophers, asking difficult questions about fate, destiny, and why they had invested so much money in floating wooden objects. You learned very quickly that the sea possessed a personality. Unfortunately, it was not always a pleasant one. One week the Mediterranean looked calm enough to convince you that stories about shipwrecks had been exaggerated. The sunlight reflected from the water, the wind filled the sails perfectly, and experienced captains spoke confidently about making excellent time. Everything felt reassuring. Then the weather changed. It always seemed to change at the worst possible moment. Isn't that true of most problems? Rarely do they arrive when convenient. Instead, they appear when your ship is loaded with expensive cargo, your investors are expecting profits, and your reputation is tied directly to the outcome. Imagine standing on the deck of a merchant vessel somewhere between Egypt and Italy. The sky darkens. The wind strengthens. Sailors who spent the morning laughing now spend the afternoon looking concerned. This is never encouraging. Experienced sailors rarely panic, but they possess a special expression reserved for situations that are becoming expensive. You begin noticing it everywhere. Ropes tighten. Orders are shouted. Waves grow larger. The deck becomes increasingly difficult to walk across without developing a sudden appreciation for handrails. At this point your cargo becomes less important than your survival. This can feel disappointing considering how much money you invested in the cargo, but priorities have a way of rearranging themselves during storms. Suddenly nobody is discussing profit margins. Nobody is negotiating contracts. Nobody is calculating market prices in Rome. Everybody is focused entirely upon remaining alive. It is remarkable how quickly human beings simplify their objectives under the right circumstances. Of course, if storms were the only danger, merchants might have slept much better. Unfortunately, there were also pirates. Human history has produced many professions. Some involved building things. Some involved growing things. Others involved looking at somebody else's hard work and deciding to steal it. Pirates belonged firmly within the third category. They had existed for centuries before Rome and would continue existing long afterward. The Mediterranean contained countless islands, hidden coves, and isolated coastlines, all of which provided excellent opportunities for individuals whose business model depended upon taking merchandise without payment. Now imagine spending months organizing a shipment. You negotiate contracts. You purchase goods. You arrange transportation. You hire crews. You complete paperwork. Everything proceeds smoothly. Then a group of armed strangers appears and develops an intense interest in becoming the new owners of your cargo. You can probably see why merchants disliked pirates. The feeling was generally mutual. Rome fought piracy constantly. Naval patrols crossed important routes. Military commanders launched campaigns. Officials promised greater security. To be fair, they achieved considerable success. The Mediterranean became much safer during the height of the empire than it had been previously. Safer, however, is not the same thing as safe. Those two words are separated by many unfortunate experiences. Merchants understood this distinction perfectly well. Even when storms remained distant and pirates remained elsewhere, business contained plenty of opportunities for disaster. Have you ever trusted somebody completely and then regretted it? Ancient merchants certainly did. A business partner might make poor decisions. A local agent might misjudge a market. A warehouse could burn. A shipment could spoil. A governor might introduce new taxes because he needed money for a public project and unfortunately noticed that merchants possessed some. This was an occupational hazard. Governments throughout history have displayed remarkable creativity whenever they discovered successful businesses. And yet, despite all these dangers, merchants continued trading. They continued investing. They continued loading ships with valuable goods and sending them across open water. Why? Because the rewards remained extraordinary. A single successful voyage could generate enough profit to justify months of anxiety. A year of successful trading could transform a comfortable fortune into an enormous one. Every risk carried the possibility of reward. Every voyage carried the possibility of success. Every departing ship represented both opportunity and uncertainty, which is perhaps the simplest way to describe the life of a Roman merchant. You spent years learning to live with uncertainty. In fact, uncertainty became so familiar that complete security might have felt strange. When a voyage arrived safely, you celebrated. When markets performed well, you celebrated. When business partners behaved honestly, you celebrated even more enthusiastically. Small victories mattered because they accumulated into larger ones. That was the secret. Not avoiding every problem. Nobody managed that. The secret was surviving enough problems to remain profitable. And if you managed that for long enough, if you survived the storms, avoided the pirates, outlasted the dishonest partners, and continued making good decisions while competitors made bad ones, something remarkable happened. People stopped seeing you as a merchant who had become wealthy and started seeing you as a wealthy man who happened to be a merchant. In Roman society, that distinction mattered far more than you might expect. People stopped seeing you as a merchant who had become wealthy and started seeing you as a wealthy man who happened to be a merchant. In Roman society, that distinction mattered far more than you might expect. Because while Rome admired soldiers, respected senators, and celebrated victorious generals, there was something undeniably appealing about a profession that allowed you to avoid becoming any of those things while still enjoying many of the rewards. Think about it for a moment. If you were born into an ordinary Roman family and someone offered you a choice, would you rather spend years marching across distant frontiers carrying heavy equipment through rain, mud, heat, and cold while hoping local tribes remained in a cooperative mood? Or would you prefer managing profitable shipments from a comfortable villa while other people carried the heavy equipment for you? The answer seems fairly obvious. At least it does from the comfort of 2,000 years later. The average Roman laborer woke before sunrise because work demanded it. The average farmer woke before sunrise because crops demanded it. The average farmer woke before sunrise because crops demanded it. The average soldier woke before sunrise because somebody with authority demanded it. You, meanwhile, often woke before sunrise because you had become accustomed to checking market reports and discussing business opportunities. The difference may appear small, but one version involved choice and the other generally involved necessity. Choice is a luxury. One of the greatest luxuries, in fact. Many Romans spent their entire lives doing work they had little control over. A merchant who achieved genuine success gained something rare. Freedom to decide how his day would be spent. Freedom to choose where he traveled. Freedom to pursue opportunities that interested him. Freedom to reject opportunities that did not. How many people in the ancient world possessed that kind of flexibility? Not many. There was also the question of comfort. Now, was a merchant's life completely effortless? Certainly not. You dealt with contracts, negotiations, risks, investments, and endless uncertainty. But compare those challenges with digging roads, working mines, rowing warships, or spending 12 hours beneath the Mediterranean sun harvesting crops. Suddenly business meetings begin sounding remarkably pleasant. Have you ever noticed that many prestigious jobs throughout history became prestigious largely because they involved less physical labor? The Romans noticed as well. Nobody attended an elegant dinner party and asked the wealthiest man in the room how many sacks of grain he had personally carried that week. That was not how status worked. Status came from influence, connections, education, success. And merchants who built trading networks across the empire possessed all four. Your social circle alone made the profession attractive. During your career you might meet governors, wealthy landowners, ship captains, bankers, magistrates, foreign traders, and influential citizens from every corner of the Roman world. Most people spent their lives interacting with the same small community. You spent yours building relationships across continents. The empire itself became your neighborhood. That sounds impressive because it was. And unlike politicians, people generally wanted to see you arrive. A senator appearing in town often meant new laws. A tax collector appearing in town usually meant fewer coins. A successful merchant appearing in town often meant opportunity. Business. Employment. Investment. People tend to appreciate those things. Then there was travel. Now, modern travel can be stressful. Delayed flights. Lost luggage. Long lines. Ancient travel possessed its own frustrations, but it also carried a sense of adventure difficult to ignore. One year you might negotiate contracts in Alexandria. The next you might be discussing prices in Antioch. Later you could find yourself walking through markets in Carthage or visiting ports in Greece. How many ordinary Romans ever experienced that? Very few. Most never traveled far from where they were born. You crossed the Mediterranean regularly. You encountered new cultures, new foods, new customs, and new opportunities. Sometimes these experiences improved your life. Sometimes they merely provided amusing stories. Both outcomes had value. There was also something satisfying about knowing that your success depended largely upon your judgment. A merchant could not control storms. He could not control politics. He could not control every market fluctuation. But he could make decisions. Good decisions. Careful decisions. Profitable decisions. And when those decisions worked, the rewards belonged to him. A farmer could work tirelessly and still lose everything to bad weather. A soldier could serve faithfully and never achieve distinction. A craftsman could produce excellent work and remain relatively unknown. A successful merchant saw a direct connection between skill and reward. That connection was powerful. Of course, wealth itself helped. It helped quite a lot. Romans occasionally pretended money was less important than virtue. Then they built enormous villas, hosted extravagant banquets, purchased imported luxuries, and spent considerable effort displaying their prosperity. Actions often reveal priorities more clearly than words. A wealthy merchant enjoyed excellent food, comfortable housing, fashionable clothing, respected company, and access to opportunities unavailable to ordinary citizens. If those are not advantages, it becomes difficult to define the word. And perhaps the greatest benefit of all was security. Not perfect security. No such thing existed. But better security than most Romans could ever imagine. If one shipment failed, you had others. One market weakened, another remained strong. If one investment disappointed, several others succeeded. Years of successful trading created resilience. Problems still occurred. They simply became easier to survive. The average Roman often lived one bad season away from serious hardship. A prosperous merchant usually enjoyed enough resources to weather difficulties that would devastate ordinary families. That peace of mind was worth a fortune by itself. In the end, that may be why becoming a wealthy merchant trader was one of the best jobs in ancient Rome. It offered wealth without requiring noble birth. Influence without requiring political office. Adventure without requiring military service. Comfort without requiring royal favor. You could begin as an ordinary citizen and build something extraordinary through intelligence, patience, relationships, and a willingness to take calculated risks. Not every merchant succeeded. Many failed. Some lost fortunes. Others lost ships. A few lost both. But for those who navigated the challenges successfully, the rewards were remarkable. And while countless Romans spent their lives working simply to survive, you had the opportunity to build a life defined by opportunity itself. The roads of the empire, the ports of the Mediterranean, the markets of distant provinces, and the fortunes hidden within every successful transaction all became part of your story. Not a bad way to spend a career in the ancient world. Still, while merchants accumulated wealth through trade and commerce, another fortunate Roman earned respect through something entirely different. Instead of moving goods across the empire, he shaped the minds of Rome's future elite. Because few positions combine comfort, influence, and intellectual prestige quite like becoming a tutor to noble children. Still, while merchants accumulated wealth through trade and commerce, another fortunate Roman earned respect through something entirely different. Instead of moving goods across the empire, he spent his days keeping some of Rome's most important people alive, which sounds straightforward until you remember that this was ancient Rome. Because if you were fortunate enough to become a court physician, you had secured one of the most respected, comfortable, and surprisingly influential positions in the entire empire. Now, at first glance, becoming a physician in ancient Rome might not sound especially appealing. After all, ancient medicine had certain limitations. Modern doctors possess hospitals, advanced equipment, scientific research, and enough specialized terminology to make ordinary people immediately stop asking follow-up questions. Roman physicians had considerably fewer advantages. Yet compared to most occupations available in the ancient world, the profession remained remarkably attractive. Think about the alternatives. You could spend your life farming. Could join the army. Could haul cargo through crowded ports. Could work in construction beneath the Mediterranean sun. Or you could spend your days inside elegant villas discussing health with wealthy aristocrats while being paid handsomely for your expertise. One of these options seems noticeably more comfortable than the others. As a court physician, your patients included senators, governors, wealthy merchants, noble families, and occasionally individuals so important that an entire city became nervous whenever they developed a cough. This brought a certain level of prestige. Most Romans would never come within speaking distance of the empire's elite. You might spend an entire afternoon advising them about their diet. The Romans loved discussing health. They loved discussing many things. Health simply happened to be one of them. A wealthy Roman might invite you into his home because he felt tired. Or because he felt energetic. Or because he sneezed twice before breakfast. Or because his cousin's neighbor once experienced similar symptoms and everybody agreed professional advice seemed appropriate. Human nature has not changed very much. People have always been capable of convincing themselves that a minor discomfort represents the beginning of a major catastrophe. This worked in your favor. The more concerned people became, the more valuable your services appeared. Your day often began with house calls. Imagine walking through some of the most impressive residences in Rome. Marble floors stretched beneath your feet. Decorative fountains filled private courtyards. Servants moved quietly through hallways carrying messages, meals, and occasionally worried expressions. Somewhere inside the house waited a patient eager to hear your opinion. Would your opinion always solve the problem? Not necessarily. Would the patient feel better after hearing it? Quite often. And that alone had value. Many illnesses improve with time, rest, and reassurance. Fortunately for physicians, patients rarely gave credit to time. They preferred crediting the physician. A very convenient arrangement. Of course, becoming a successful court physician required genuine skill. Wealthy Romans did not hire just anyone. Reputation mattered enormously. If important people trusted your judgment, more important people soon followed. Recommendations spread quickly through elite circles. One satisfied senator introduced another. One successful treatment led to additional clients. Before long, your schedule became filled with appointments from some of the most influential families in the empire. This created opportunities unavailable to most Romans. Imagine attending a dinner hosted by a powerful nobleman. Around you sat governors, merchants, magistrates, military officers, and scholars. Most guests had spent years attempting to gain access to such company. You were there because somebody needed advice about recurring headaches. Life can be wonderfully unpredictable. Your position also offered a degree of security that many professions lacked. Wealthy clients paid well. Extremely wealthy clients paid even better. Successful physicians could accumulate substantial fortunes while avoiding many of the dangers faced by soldiers, sailors, and merchants. No storms. No pirates. No barbarian invasions. At least not during working hours. Compared to crossing the Mediterranean with valuable cargo, diagnosing stomach problems suddenly looked very appealing. Naturally, the profession was not entirely stress-free. Treating ordinary patients carried responsibility. Treating important patients carried considerably more. If a farmer ignored your advice, relatively few people noticed. If a senator ignored your advice and something unfortunate happened afterward, everybody suddenly became interested in your professional opinion. That could create uncomfortable conversations. Especially when ambitious politicians started asking questions. Court physicians therefore learned diplomacy alongside medicine. Sometimes your greatest challenge involved managing expectations rather than symptoms. Wealthy patients expected answers. They expected confidence. They expected reassurance. Ideally, they also expected to recover. Providing all four at the same time occasionally required creativity. Fortunately, Roman physicians possessed plenty of confidence. Confidence was one of the most widely available medical resources in the ancient world. Patients appreciated it. Even when they probably shouldn't have. Still, compared with most Romans, your daily life remained remarkably pleasant. While laborers exhausted themselves with physical work, you relied upon knowledge. While soldiers marched across dangerous frontiers, you traveled between elegant homes. While merchants worried about storms destroying their investments, you worried about whether a wealthy client would follow dietary advice for longer than 3 hours. History suggests they often did not. People have always preferred enjoyable habits to healthy ones. Some traditions are timeless. Yet despite these occasional frustrations, the advantages remained extraordinary. You enjoyed respect. You enjoyed comfort. You enjoyed influence. Most importantly, you enjoyed access to the highest levels of Roman society. Emperors consulted physicians. Senators trusted physicians. Noble families depended upon physicians. In a world where power shaped nearly every aspect of life, spending your career surrounded by powerful people was rarely a disadvantage. And unlike many influential Romans, you achieved your position through knowledge rather than inheritance. Nobody could inherit your expertise. Nobody could purchase your experience. They needed you because you possessed something valuable. That is a powerful place to occupy. In an empire filled with soldiers seeking glory, politicians seeking influence, and merchants seeking profit, the court physician occupied a unique position. You earned wealth without needing ships. Prestige without needing noble birth. Influence without needing public office. And while others spent their lives competing for power, people voluntarily invited you into their homes because they genuinely wanted your help. Not a bad arrangement. Especially in ancient Rome, where staying healthy was often considerably more challenging than becoming sick. If you were fortunate enough to become an imperial librarian in ancient Rome, you had discovered one of the closest things the ancient world offered to an intellectual paradise. While countless Romans spent their days farming, marching, building roads, hauling cargo, collecting taxes, avoiding taxes, or arguing about taxes, you spent your time surrounded by knowledge. An astonishing amount of knowledge. In fact, there were days when it probably felt as though the entire Roman Empire had become determined to write everything down. And then store it in your library. Now, when most people imagine ancient Rome, they tend to picture gladiators, emperors, senators, triumphal processions, and dramatic political speeches delivered by men who had clearly practiced them in front of a mirror. Very few people imagine librarians. This is unfortunate. Because librarians were quietly living some of the most comfortable lives in the empire. Think about it for a moment. If you were an ordinary Roman laborer, your day began with physical work. If you were a soldier, your day began with orders. If you were a farmer, your day began with concerns about weather. If you were a librarian, your day began with scrolls. Thousands of scrolls. Admittedly, scrolls create their own problems. But very few of those problems involve carrying heavy stones uphill. That alone represented a significant advantage. Your workplace was unlike anything most Romans would ever experience. Great libraries were among the most impressive institutions in the empire. Marble columns lined entrances. Statues of philosophers observed visitors with expressions suggesting they had been waiting centuries for somebody to ask an intelligent question. Reading rooms echoed softly with conversation. Scholars moved between shelves carrying texts that contained centuries of accumulated knowledge. It was a world built around ideas. And ideas were surprisingly valuable. The Romans conquered many things. Territories. Kingdoms. Cities. Entire peoples. Yet they also collected knowledge with remarkable enthusiasm. Whenever Roman armies entered famous cities, somebody inevitably developed an interest in the local libraries. Books traveled. Scrolls traveled. Philosophical works traveled. Historical records traveled. Eventually they arrived on your shelves. This sounds exciting. It was. It was also slightly terrifying. Because once knowledge arrived, somebody had to organize it. That somebody was often you. Have you ever misplaced an important document? Perhaps a certificate. A passport. A receipt. Now imagine misplacing an entire philosophical masterpiece that scholars had spent decades trying to locate. The pressure increases somewhat. Roman libraries contained works on history, law, medicine, mathematics, engineering, literature, astronomy, geography, rhetoric, philosophy, religion, politics, and countless other subjects. Every scroll required classification. Every shelf required organization. Every visitor expected you to know where everything was located. This expectation was remarkably optimistic. Yet somehow you usually managed. Experience helped. Memory helped. Patience helped even more. Because scholars could be difficult. Now, scholars are wonderful people. History would be considerably less interesting without them. But anybody who spends most of the day thinking about complicated questions eventually develops certain personality traits. A philosopher might spend an hour discussing the nature of reality. A historian might spend an hour arguing about a date. A poet might spend an hour debating the meaning of a single sentence. And all three expected you to locate their preferred scroll immediately. Libraries therefore require diplomacy. A skill often more useful than people realized. Fortunately, compared with most Roman professions, your problems remained pleasantly civilized. Nobody invaded your workplace. Usually. Nobody demanded that you march hundreds of miles carrying military equipment. Nobody expected you to harvest crops beneath a blazing summer sun. Your greatest crisis might involve discovering that somebody had returned a scroll to the wrong shelf. This could still be alarming. But it was a different category of alarming. The position also carried considerable prestige. Romans respected education. Or at least they respected appearing educated. This distinction occasionally mattered. A wealthy senator might proudly display a library containing hundreds of scrolls despite having read perhaps 12 of them. Visitors would admire the collection. The senator would nod thoughtfully. Everybody involved understood the arrangement. Books were status symbols. Knowledge was status. And you were responsible for managing both. Not a bad place to find yourself. The best part was access. Most Romans spent their lives interacting with people from their immediate surroundings. Farmers knew farmers. Soldiers knew soldiers. Craftsmen knew craftsmen. You knew everybody. Well, perhaps not everybody. But a surprising number of important people. Senators visited libraries. Officials visited libraries. Teachers visited libraries. Philosophers visited libraries. Writers visited libraries. Occasionally even emperors developed an interest in libraries. This meant that your daily routine placed you in contact with some of the most educated and influential individuals in the empire. Imagine helping a famous scholar locate a rare manuscript. Imagine discussing history with a senator. Imagine overhearing conversations between some of the brightest minds in Rome. For somebody who loved learning, this was extraordinarily rewarding. For somebody who enjoyed gossip, it was even better. Libraries attracted information. Not just written information. Social information. Political information. Intellectual information. People talked. Romans always talked. A library might appear quiet compared with a marketplace, but ideas moved through the building constantly. New books arrived. New theories appeared. New arguments emerged. New discoveries circulated. The empire flowed through your workplace in the form of words. And unlike grain shipments or tax revenues, words required remarkably little storage space. At least individually. Collectively they became your responsibility. Which meant every morning you entered one of the greatest collections of knowledge in the ancient world and attempted to keep it organized. No small task. Still, compared with the alternatives available to most Romans, it remained an exceptionally comfortable challenge. The average laborer worried about injuries. The average sailor worried about storms. The average merchant worried about profits. The average soldier worried about enemies. You worried about whether somebody had borrowed an important manuscript and forgotten where they left it. One of these concerns feels noticeably preferable to the others. Of course, as your experience grew, so did your responsibilities. Because organizing a few shelves of scrolls was one thing. Managing one of the greatest repositories of knowledge in the Roman world was something else entirely. And before long, you discovered that keeping track of thousands upon thousands of scrolls required a level of organization that bordered on obsession. And before long, you discovered that keeping track of thousands upon thousands of scrolls required a level of organization that bordered on obsession. The problem was not simply the number of scrolls. The problem was that Romans kept creating more of them. Every year brought new histories, new speeches, new legal records, new poems, new philosophical works, new scientific observations, and new documents that somebody somewhere considered important enough to preserve forever. Occasionally they were correct. Occasionally they were not. Unfortunately, determining which was which often fell to people like you. Imagine arriving at work one morning and being informed that several crates of manuscripts had arrived from another city. Wonderful news. Knowledge was always welcome. Then you discover the crates contain hundreds of scrolls copied by different scribes, organized according to completely different systems, and labeled with handwriting that appears to have been produced during an earthquake. Suddenly the morning becomes more complicated. This was the reality of managing a Roman library. People often imagine ancient libraries as quiet places where wise scholars sat peacefully reading profound texts. There was certainly some of that. But there was also a tremendous amount of practical work. Scrolls needed cataloging. Shelves needed organizing. Records needed updating. Visitors needed assistance. Scribes needed supervision. New acquisitions needed processing. Knowledge, it turned out, generated paperwork. Even in the ancient world. Your first challenge was remembering where everything belonged. This sounds simple until you realize that a major Roman library could contain thousands upon thousands of works. Histories occupied one section. Legal texts occupied another. Philosophical writings filled entire collections by themselves. Poetry had its own place. Medical works had theirs. Geography, astronomy, rhetoric, mathematics, engineering, and countless other subjects all required careful arrangement. Now imagine somebody returning a scroll to the wrong location. Just one scroll. Surely that couldn't cause much trouble. Except that one misplaced scroll often became several misplaced scrolls. Several misplaced scrolls became an afternoon of searching. An afternoon of searching became a very frustrated scholar demanding answers. And a frustrated scholar was rarely a quiet scholar. Have you ever lost something and become increasingly convinced that somebody else must be responsible? Roman scholars experienced this feeling frequently. As librarian, you became remarkably familiar with it. A visitor would arrive looking for a particular text. You would direct him to the correct section. A few moments later he would return claiming the manuscript had vanished. This was usually followed by a lengthy explanation regarding the importance of the manuscript, the urgency of his research, and the unfortunate consequences of not finding it immediately. The manuscript was often exactly where it was supposed to be. The scholar simply had not looked carefully. Human nature has always been wonderfully consistent. Still, there were occasions when something genuinely disappeared. Those days tended to be less enjoyable. Because unlike modern books, many ancient scrolls existed in very limited numbers. Some works had only a handful of surviving copies. Others possessed only one. Imagine being responsible for preserving a document that nobody else possessed. The pressure was considerable. Fire remained the greatest fear. Every librarian understood this. Libraries contained enormous quantities of papyrus. Papyrus burned remarkably well. Roman buildings relied upon oil lamps. Oil lamps occasionally fell over. You can probably see where this becomes concerning. The average Roman worried about fires destroying his house. You worried about fires destroying centuries of accumulated knowledge. A slightly larger responsibility. This is why librarians became cautious people. Lamps were monitored carefully. Storage conditions mattered. Visitors carrying open flames inspired immediate concern. If somebody walked into the library behaving carelessly around valuable manuscripts, your reaction was probably similar to that of a modern museum curator watching somebody approach a priceless artifact with sticky fingers. Not panic exactly. But close enough. Fortunately, preserving scrolls involved more than preventing disasters. It also required maintaining them. Papyrus aged. Ink faded. Physical damage accumulated over time. Important texts therefore needed copying. This brought you into regular contact with scribes. Scribes were fascinating individuals. They spent their days reproducing documents by hand, one line at a time, often for hours without interruption. This required patience, concentration, and a willingness to spend extraordinary amounts of time staring at handwriting. Not everybody possessed these qualities. The best scribes became highly valued. A skilled copyist could preserve knowledge for future generations. A careless copyist could accidentally transform a serious philosophical argument into complete nonsense. Mistakes happened. More often than anyone preferred. Imagine discovering that a copied manuscript contained an error halfway through several hundred lines of text. Correcting it required time. Verifying accuracy required more time. Supervising the process required even more. Fortunately, compared to military campaigns and tax collection, these remained relatively civilized problems. And that was one of the great advantages of the profession. Your challenges were intellectual rather than physical. While laborers strained their backs carrying stone blocks, you strained your memory remembering shelf locations. While soldiers marched across dangerous frontiers, you walked between reading rooms. While merchants worried about storms sinking ships loaded with expensive cargo, you worried about whether a philosopher had returned the correct manuscript. Perspective matters. From time to time, visitors seemed genuinely amazed by the scale of the collections under your care. They entered reading halls lined with shelves. They saw row after row of carefully organized manuscripts. They realized that centuries of human thought surrounded them. The effect could be surprisingly powerful. After all, where else could someone encounter the accumulated wisdom of historians, poets, scientists, politicians, mathematicians, engineers, physicians, and philosophers all in a single building? The library was more than storage. It was memory. The memory of cities. The memory of empires. The memory of generations. And somehow that memory depended, at least in part, upon your ability to remember where a particular scroll had been placed. There is something wonderfully ironic about that. A building dedicated to preserving civilization occasionally relied upon one librarian muttering to himself while searching for a manuscript that somebody had left in entirely the wrong place. Yet despite these occasional frustrations, there was genuine satisfaction in the work. Every correctly catalogued text improved the collection. Every preserved manuscript increased the chances that knowledge would survive. Every successful copy protected ideas from being lost forever. Not many professions could claim that. You were not merely organizing scrolls. You were preserving history itself. And as the years passed, your reputation grew. Scholars began recognizing your expertise. Visitors trusted your judgment. Important officials valued your assistance. Because after spending years among thousands of manuscripts, you gradually became something more than a librarian. You became a guide through the vast landscape of Roman knowledge, and before long some of the most educated and influential people in the empire were seeking your help to navigate it. You became a guide through the vast landscape of Roman knowledge, and before long some of the most educated and influential people in the empire were seeking your help to navigate it. This was one of the unexpected advantages of becoming an imperial librarian. Most Romans spent their lives surrounded by people very much like themselves. Farmers spoke with farmers. Soldiers lived among soldiers. Merchants negotiated with merchants. But a library attracted everybody. Or at least everybody who considered themselves intelligent, which in Rome was a surprisingly large number of people. The first visitors usually arrived shortly after sunrise. Some came carrying notebooks. Others arrived carrying assistants. A few arrived carrying expressions that suggested they had spent the entire night thinking about an obscure philosophical question and intended to spend the entire day discussing it. These were often the philosophers. You learned to recognize them immediately. Not because they dressed differently. Because they asked different questions. A merchant might ask where he could find information about trade routes. A senator might request legal records. A historian might search for old accounts of military campaigns. A philosopher, however, might spend 20 minutes attempting to determine whether knowledge itself truly existed before finally asking where the philosophy section was located. Libraries attracted remarkable people. They also attracted remarkably complicated people. Imagine spending your day surrounded by some of the brightest minds in the Roman world. Scholars arrived from distant provinces. Teachers brought students. Writers searched for inspiration. Researchers hunted for rare manuscripts. Every reading room contained conversations about history, politics, science, literature, law, and countless other subjects. For somebody who loved learning, it was paradise. For somebody who preferred silence, it could occasionally feel less peaceful than advertised. Roman intellectuals enjoyed debate. Actually, enjoyed might be too weak a word. They lived for debate. Give two scholars the same text and they could produce 3 different interpretations. Give 3 scholars the same text and they could produce enough disagreement to occupy an entire afternoon. As librarian, you occupied an interesting position. You were not always participating in these discussions. But you heard them. All of them. Day after day. Year after year. Eventually you developed a remarkable understanding of the intellectual life of the empire simply by listening. And listening had advantages. People often spoke more freely around librarians than they did around politicians. A senator entering a room could change a conversation immediately. A librarian rarely did. This meant you heard ideas while they were still being formed. New theories. New arguments. New discoveries. New rumors. Especially rumors. Romans loved rumors almost as much as they loved politics. The two subjects frequently overlapped. Of course, not every visitor was a scholar. Some possessed considerably more influence. Senators visited libraries regularly. Roman politics depended upon speeches, laws, history, and legal precedent. All of those things lived inside libraries. Imagine a senator preparing for an important debate. He needed evidence. Historical examples. Legal references. Quotations from respected authorities. Where did he find them? Usually through people like you. This gave the librarian a surprisingly important role. You weren't making political decisions. You weren't writing legislation. Yet some of the most powerful men in the empire occasionally depended upon your knowledge of the collection. There is something amusing about that. A man capable of commanding entire provinces might spend half an hour asking where a particular scroll had been placed. Power has limits. Even Roman power. Some visitors were famous throughout the empire. Celebrated historians. Renowned teachers. Distinguished philosophers. Successful writers. People whose names traveled far beyond Rome itself. Now imagine helping one of them locate a manuscript. At first this might seem intimidating. Then you realize they are simply people. Intelligent people, certainly. Important people, often. But still people. And people remain remarkably consistent regardless of their reputation. The famous historian still misplaces notes. The celebrated philosopher still forgets where he left a scroll. The respected writer still misses deadlines. History becomes much more relatable when you notice these details. One of the most enjoyable aspects of the profession was watching knowledge move through the empire. A scholar might arrive carrying a newly copied text from Alexandria. Another might bring research from Athens. A teacher could introduce ideas spreading through distant provinces. Libraries acted like crossroads where information from every corner of the Roman world eventually met. You witnessed this constantly. The empire was vast. Its knowledge was even larger. And somehow much of it passed through your hands. This created a certain prestige. Not the dramatic prestige enjoyed by generals returning from victory. Not the political prestige enjoyed by senators. A quieter prestige. The respect given to somebody who knows things. Romans valued expertise. They admired education. They respected individuals capable of navigating complex subjects. After years spent among thousands of manuscripts, your reputation naturally grew. People sought your advice. People trusted your memory. People respected your judgment. And unlike many forms of status in ancient Rome, this reputation came from experience rather than birth. You earned it. Which made it all the more satisfying. Of course, there were moments when the work became overwhelming. A crowded library could feel surprisingly chaotic. Scholars searched for manuscripts. Students requested assistance. Scribes delivered new copies. Officials required records. Visitors asked questions from every direction. For a few hours, it might seem as though the entire intellectual life of Rome had decided to arrive simultaneously. Then somehow everything settled down again. The scrolls returned to their shelves. The scholars returned to their studies. The debates quieted. And once more you found yourself walking through halls filled with the accumulated knowledge of centuries. Not a bad way to spend a working day. Especially when compared with the average Roman laborer, who at that exact moment was probably carrying something extremely heavy because somebody wealthier had instructed him to do so. Meanwhile, you spent your afternoon discussing history with famous scholars, assisting influential senators, and helping some of the brightest minds in the empire find the information they needed. For an imperial librarian, that was simply another ordinary day among the scrolls. And before long some of the most educated and influential people in the empire were seeking your help to navigate it, which meant your day rarely unfolded the same way twice. You might begin the morning helping a historian locate an account of an old military campaign, only to find yourself an hour later assisting a senator searching for legal precedents to support an argument he planned to deliver before an audience that afternoon. The senator, naturally, considered this speech extremely important. Roman senators always considered their speeches extremely important. If a senator announced he was making a brief comment, wise listeners prepared for a lengthy experience. Still, helping these visitors had advantages. The more often important people visited the library, the more often they visited you. After all, they knew the library contained thousands of scrolls. You knew where those scrolls actually were. This made you surprisingly useful. Have you ever noticed how quickly powerful people become friendly when they need something? Roman politicians had mastered this skill centuries before modern politicians were even invented. One day a senator might ask for historical records. The next day he might return because somebody mentioned another manuscript during a debate. Then he would return again because the first manuscript referenced a second manuscript. Before long he was spending half his week inside the library and beginning conversations with phrases like, "I just need one more scroll." Historians have since confirmed that this sentence was almost never true. The interesting thing was that senators were not even your most frequent visitors. Scholars occupied that position comfortably. Scholars loved libraries in the same way sailors loved ships. They simply belonged there. A philosopher might arrive shortly after sunrise and still be reading when the evening lamps were lit. Sometimes they became so absorbed in their work that they forgot meals entirely. Imagine being so interested in a manuscript that you accidentally skip lunch. Most Romans would have considered this evidence of a medical condition. Writers were not much better. They arrived searching for inspiration and frequently left carrying enough material to produce 3 entirely different books. Of course, first they had to write them. This was where difficulties often began. Writers throughout history have displayed a remarkable talent for researching projects instead of finishing them. The library therefore contained a surprising number of people who claimed they were almost done with something. Months later they were still almost done. Yet this constant stream of visitors gave the library an unusual atmosphere. It was never simply a building full of scrolls. It was a place where ideas met each other. A historian discovered a philosopher's work. A philosopher encountered a legal text. A teacher found a manuscript copied from a distant province. Every day new connections appeared. Every day new conversations started. Every day somebody walked through the doors hoping to learn something they did not know yesterday. And somehow you stood at the center of all of it. Not because you were the most famous person in the building. Usually you weren't. Not because you were the richest person there. Almost certainly you weren't. But because every road through the library eventually passed by you. Every visitor needed guidance. Every scholar needed assistance. Every important person eventually asked a question. And after years spent among thousands of scrolls, you usually knew the answer. And after years spent among thousands of scrolls, you usually knew the answer. The problem was that knowing where knowledge was stored and keeping that knowledge alive were two very different challenges. A scroll could survive for centuries and then disappear in a single afternoon. That realization never completely left your mind. Every time you walked through the library, every time you watched scholars studying manuscripts older than their grandfathers, every time a visitor carefully unrolled a rare text, you understood something many Romans never considered. Knowledge was fragile. Not weak. Fragile. There is a difference. A powerful idea could survive for generations. A scroll containing that idea could be destroyed by a dropped lamp. And Roman lamps had an unfortunate habit of containing fire. Have you ever noticed how many things in history seem determined to catch fire? Ancient cities were particularly talented at it. Wooden furniture, papyrus scrolls, oil lamps, crowded buildings, individually these things were manageable. Together they occasionally became exciting for all the wrong reasons. As a librarian, few words inspired more concern than smoke. Not invasion. Not rebellion. Not politics. Smoke. Because smoke often meant fire, and fire did not care whether a scroll contained a shopping list or centuries of accumulated wisdom. It destroyed both with remarkable efficiency. This meant a surprising amount of your professional life involved preventing disasters nobody else was thinking about. Visitors saw shelves. You saw potential hazards. Visitors admired collections. You calculated risks. Visitors enjoyed knowledge. You worried about preserving it. Then there was politics. Now politics rarely arrives announcing itself as a problem. Politics generally arrives disguised as a reasonable request. A senator wants a document. A governor wants a record. An official wants access to a collection. Everything appears perfectly ordinary until two important people want completely different things from the same manuscript. That was when your day became complicated. Libraries preserved history. History contained evidence. Evidence could support arguments. Arguments created winners and losers. Suddenly a scroll copied decades earlier became surprisingly important. You learned very quickly that knowledge possessed power, and powerful people paid attention to anything that might strengthen their position. Fortunately, librarians occupied a useful role. You were not expected to take sides. You were expected to know where the documents were. This was generally a safer arrangement. Generally. The greatest danger, however, was often much simpler than fire or politics. People. Specifically people borrowing things. Have you ever lent somebody an item and never seen it again? Now imagine that item is an irreplaceable manuscript copied by hand generations earlier. A scholar takes it for research. A teacher borrows it for study. An official requests it temporarily. Temporary proved to be a wonderfully flexible word. Months later you might still be searching. Entire careers could be spent hunting for missing texts. Sometimes they returned. Sometimes they didn't. Every librarian eventually developed a slightly suspicious attitude whenever somebody promised they would bring a scroll back soon. Yet despite all these risks, despite the fires, the politics, the misplaced manuscripts, and the endless responsibility, you kept returning every morning. Because protecting knowledge was worth the effort. And perhaps more importantly, the job itself was remarkably comfortable compared with almost everything else available in ancient Rome. Because protecting knowledge was worth the effort. And perhaps more importantly, the job itself was remarkably comfortable compared with almost everything else available in ancient Rome. Think about it for a moment. If somebody offered you a choice between marching across distant frontiers with the army, spending 12 hours harvesting crops beneath the summer sun, unloading cargo at crowded docks, or spending your day surrounded by books, scholars, and some of the brightest minds in the empire, which option would you choose? The answer seems fairly obvious. At least from a comfortable chair. The average Roman worked with his body. You worked with your mind. The average laborer finished the day exhausted. You finished the day educated. The average soldier worried about enemies. The average merchant worried about storms. The average farmer worried about weather. You worried about whether a philosopher had returned a manuscript to the correct shelf. One of these problems feels noticeably less dangerous. There was also the company you kept. Most Romans never spoke with famous historians. Most never met respected philosophers. Most never spent afternoons helping senators locate documents or discussing literature with visiting scholars. You did all of these things regularly. What began as a job gradually became access to an entire world of ideas. And ideas have a remarkable habit of making life interesting. Every day brought something new. A newly copied manuscript. A visitor from a distant province. An unfamiliar theory. A forgotten text rediscovered after years of being overlooked. Even after decades in the profession, surprises continued appearing. That alone separated the work from many occupations. Routine can become exhausting. Curiosity rarely does. Then there was the respect. Romans admired wealth. They admired power. But they also admired knowledge. An experienced librarian possessed something valuable that could not simply be inherited or purchased. Experience. Memory. Understanding. People trusted your expertise because you had earned it. That trust mattered. And unlike politicians, you rarely needed to campaign for it. By the standards of the ancient world, the position offered almost everything a person could reasonably want. Security. Comfort. Prestige. Intellectual stimulation. Influential connections. Meaningful work. Few professions combined all of them. Which is why becoming an imperial librarian was one of the best jobs in ancient Rome. While countless others spent their lives building roads, fighting wars, collecting taxes, or struggling simply to survive, you spent yours protecting humanity's knowledge. Not a bad trade at all. And among the shelves of Rome's greatest libraries, surrounded by the voices of generations past, you may have discovered something even more valuable than wealth. You discovered the rare privilege of spending your life learning. If you were fortunate enough to become an Argentarius, a Roman banker, you had discovered one of the few professions in ancient Rome where spending all day thinking about money could eventually result in having quite a lot of it yourself. While most Romans spent their days hauling cargo through crowded streets, working fields beneath the Mediterranean sun, or marching across distant frontiers carrying enough equipment to resemble a traveling warehouse, you spent your time surrounded by coins. An astonishing number of coins. Silver coins. Gold coins. Bronze coins. Coins arriving. Coins departing. Coins changing hands so frequently that you occasionally wondered whether they were getting more exercise than the average Roman citizen. Now, banking may not sound especially glamorous at first. After all, when people imagine ancient Rome, they tend to picture gladiators, emperors, senators, triumphal parades, and dramatic speeches delivered by men wearing enough fabric to supply a small village. Very few people imagine bankers. This is unfortunate. Because bankers were quietly enjoying some of the most comfortable lives in the empire. Think about it for a moment. A farmer's fortune depended on weather. A sailor's fortune depended on the sea. A merchant's fortune depended on trade. A soldier's fortune depended on surviving. Your fortune depended largely on mathematics. And mathematics rarely sank ships. As an Argentarius, your day often began inside the busy commercial districts of Rome, where merchants, traders, property owners, and ambitious businessmen arrived carrying bags of coins and even larger bags of concerns. Somebody needed a loan. Somebody wanted to deposit money. Somebody wished to finance a shipment heading toward Alexandria. Somebody else had somehow spent more money than he possessed and was now hoping you could transform this unfortunate situation into a temporary inconvenience. Human beings have been remarkably creative with financial problems for thousands of years. Fortunately, they were willing to pay for solutions. This worked in your favor. The interesting thing about Roman banking was that money itself was only part of the business. Trust mattered far more. Imagine handing a substantial portion of your wealth to another person and trusting that he would return it later. That sounds stressful because it is. Yet Romans did it constantly. Your reputation became your greatest asset. If people trusted you, they brought their money. If they brought their money, opportunities followed. If opportunities followed, profits usually arrived shortly afterward. A very pleasant sequence of events. Of course, not every customer was easy to deal with. Some arrived convinced they were financial geniuses despite possessing evidence to the contrary. Others wanted loans for business ventures that sounded impressive until you listened carefully. Have you ever heard somebody describe a terrible idea with tremendous confidence? Roman bankers heard such presentations regularly. A merchant might promise enormous profits from a risky voyage. A property owner might insist his investment could not possibly fail. A businessman might explain why borrowing money was actually helping you. Experienced bankers learned to smile politely during these conversations. Experience also taught them caution. Because unlike philosophers, bankers could not survive entirely on interesting ideas. Eventually somebody expected repayment. This made your profession surprisingly important. Merchants needed capital. Traders needed financing. Property transactions required money. Partnerships required money. Large business ventures required even more money. The Roman economy moved because people like you helped keep it moving. You sat quietly behind a desk while enormous sums passed through your hands. Not a bad arrangement. Especially when compared with digging roads. There was also a certain prestige attached to success. Wealthy clients preferred dealing with successful bankers. Successful bankers attracted wealthy clients. The cycle reinforced itself beautifully. Before long you might find senators, merchants, landowners, and influential citizens visiting your establishment regularly. Some came seeking loans. Others came seeking advice. A few simply came because they trusted your judgment. That trust was valuable. Very valuable. In fact, it was often worth more than the coins sitting in front of you. The best part was that your work placed you at the center of Roman commerce without requiring you to endure many of its dangers. Merchants faced storms. Sailors faced pirates. Soldiers faced enemies. Farmers faced droughts. You faced account books. Now, account books could certainly be frustrating. But they rarely attacked. At the end of the day, that may be why becoming an Argentarius was one of the best jobs in ancient Rome. You enjoyed wealth, influence, comfort, and respect while avoiding many of the hardships endured by ordinary citizens. People came to you when they needed help. Powerful individuals valued your services. Business opportunities appeared constantly. And while much of the empire worked tirelessly to earn money, your profession revolved around understanding how money worked in the first place. In ancient Rome, that was a remarkably profitable skill to possess. Power in ancient Rome came in many forms. Some men commanded legions. Some controlled vast fortunes. Some delivered speeches before the Senate. And then there were the individuals who quietly sat beside the governor, reading every report, writing every important letter, organizing every official document, and knowing far more about what was happening in the province than almost anyone else. Those men were the governor's secretaries. Now, this may not sound like the most exciting position in the Roman Empire. After all, nobody built triumphal arches to celebrate excellent paperwork. Crowds rarely gathered to cheer a particularly well-organized archive. And historians tend to spend considerably more time discussing governors than the people who spent every day working beside them. This is unfortunate. Because becoming a governor's secretary was one of the closest things ancient Rome offered to a comfortable path toward influence, prestige, and security. While countless Romans spent their lives farming, marching, hauling cargo, paying taxes, or collecting taxes from people who were understandably unhappy about the arrangement, you spent your days at the very center of provincial government, surrounded by information, important visitors, and enough political intrigue to keep an entire generation of historians busy. Words were surprisingly valuable in ancient Rome. A talented general could win a battle, a wealthy merchant could finance a fleet, and a powerful governor could administer an entire province, but none of those achievements meant very much unless somebody could describe them in a way that made people remember them. That was where poets entered the picture. While most Romans spent their lives carrying things, building things, growing things, repairing things, or occasionally destroying things under official government supervision, you spent your days arranging words. And remarkably, people paid you very well for it. Now, at first glance, becoming a court poet might sound like an unusual path to success. After all, when people imagine ancient Rome, they tend to picture gladiators fighting in arenas, senators arguing in public buildings, and emperors making decisions that would eventually give historians something to debate for centuries. Very few people imagine a poet sitting comfortably in a luxurious villa trying to decide whether one line sounds better than another. This is unfortunate. Because compared with most occupations available in the empire, the poet's life was remarkably pleasant. Think about it for a moment. A farmer worried about weather. A sailor worried about storms. A soldier worried about enemies. A merchant worried about investments. You worried about adjectives. One of these concerns feels noticeably less dangerous than the others. The interesting thing was that powerful Romans loved poetry. They loved hearing poetry. They loved sponsoring poetry. Most of all, they loved poetry that happened to mention how intelligent, generous, courageous, honorable, wise, or magnificent they were. This created opportunities. Because while not every wealthy Roman could command an army or deliver a brilliant speech, almost every wealthy Roman enjoyed listening to somebody explain why he was exceptional. Human nature has always been wonderfully predictable. And if you possessed talent, education, and enough social awareness to understand what your audience wanted to hear, those opportunities could become surprisingly profitable. Raising children has always been a challenging responsibility. Raising the children of wealthy Roman nobles was something else entirely. Because if you became a tutor to noble children in ancient Rome, you discovered one of the few professions where your daily responsibilities included educating future senators, future governors, future generals, and occasionally future problems. Very expensive future problems. Now, at first glance, teaching children may not sound like one of the best jobs in the Roman world. After all, children have never been famous for their appreciation of education. Roman children were no exception. Give a child the choice between studying grammar and doing almost anything else, and history suggests grammar rarely wins. Yet compared with most Roman occupations, becoming a tutor was remarkably comfortable. Think about it for a moment. The average farmer spent his day worrying about crops. The average merchant spent his day worrying about profits. The average sailor spent his day worrying about storms. The average soldier spent his day worrying about enemies. You spent your day explaining literature to wealthy teenagers. Admittedly, wealthy teenagers occasionally behaved like enemies. But the overall danger remained considerably lower. The interesting thing about Roman noble families was that education mattered enormously. Wealthy parents wanted their sons prepared for public life. A future senator needed to speak persuasively. A future governor needed to understand law. A future official needed knowledge of history, politics, rhetoric, literature, and philosophy. In short, Roman aristocrats wanted intelligent heirs. Or at least heirs capable of appearing intelligent during important conversations. This was where you entered the picture. Every morning began inside some of the most impressive homes in the empire. While ordinary Romans squeezed through crowded streets on their way to workshops and markets, you walked through elegant courtyards surrounded by marble columns, decorative gardens, fountains, and enough expensive artwork to fund a small military campaign. Not a bad workplace. Your students, however, often required motivation. Have you ever noticed that children become remarkably creative when searching for reasons not to study? Ancient Roman children mastered this skill long before modern education was invented. Some suddenly developed an interest in sports. Others discovered urgent reasons to leave the room. A few became fascinated by literally anything except the lesson in front of them. Human nature has always been consistent. Fortunately, successful tutors learned quickly that teaching involved more than knowledge. It required patience. A tremendous amount of patience. You explained grammar. Then you explained it again. Then you explained it differently. Then you listened as your student confidently misunderstood everything you had just said. This happened often enough to become part of the profession. Still, compared with many Roman careers, these were comfortable frustrations. Nobody expected you to march across hostile territory. Nobody expected you to survive shipwrecks. Nobody expected you to harvest crops beneath a blazing summer sun. Your greatest challenge might involve convincing an aristocratic teenager that reading history was somehow more important than chasing entertainment. A difficult task. But still preferable to fighting barbarians. The real advantage of the profession became obvious over time. You were not simply teaching children. You were teaching future leaders. The young student struggling through lessons today might one day become a senator. Another could become a provincial governor. A third might command armies. The relationships you built often lasted decades. That gave the position unusual influence. Imagine a young nobleman spending years learning under your guidance. You teach him literature. You teach him rhetoric. You teach him history. More importantly, you teach him how to think. Years later he enters public life. He remembers those lessons. People rarely forget the teachers who shaped their childhood. Especially when those teachers managed to make education interesting. This created opportunities unavailable to most Romans. Former students often remained valuable connections. A tutor who earned the respect of influential families could enjoy long-term patronage, social prestige, and financial security. Wealthy households recommended successful tutors to other wealthy households. Before long, your reputation spread throughout aristocratic circles. And reputation mattered in Rome. A great deal. There was also something genuinely rewarding about the work itself. Not every student became brilliant. Not every lesson succeeded. Some days felt frustrating. Some students seemed determined to test the limits of your patience. Yet occasionally you watched a young mind begin to understand something difficult. A complicated historical event suddenly made sense. A piece of literature revealed its meaning. A hesitant speaker delivered an impressive argument. Those moments were satisfying. Perhaps more satisfying than most people realize. Because unlike merchants, you were not building wealth. Unlike soldiers, you were not building victories. Unlike politicians, you were not building careers. You were helping build people. And people often lasted longer than any of those things. Of course, the profession came with additional benefits. Wealthy families paid well. Successful tutors enjoyed comfortable accommodations. Meals were excellent. Working conditions were civilized. Your daily environment contained books rather than battlefields, discussions rather than disasters, and educated conversation rather than physical labor. One of these lifestyles feels noticeably more appealing, especially when viewed from a comfortable distance of 2,000 years. By Roman standards, the position offered an unusually attractive combination of comfort, prestige, stability, and influence. You spent your days surrounded by learning. You interacted with elite families. You shaped future leaders. You avoided most of the dangers that dominated ordinary Roman life. And while countless citizens spent their entire lives struggling simply to survive, you occupied a role where knowledge itself created opportunity. Not a bad arrangement. Particularly in ancient Rome, where a sharp mind could sometimes travel much further than a strong sword. Beauty was surprisingly important in ancient Rome. Emperors wanted magnificent palaces. Senators wanted impressive villas. Wealthy nobles wanted elegant courtyards. And somewhere behind all that beauty stood a fortunate individual whose entire profession revolved around making plants behave themselves. That individual was the keeper of the imperial gardens. Now, at first glance, this may not sound like one of the best jobs in the Roman Empire. After all, gardening rarely receives the same attention as politics, military victories, or imperial intrigue. Historians tend to write far more books about emperors than the people responsible for keeping imperial roses alive. This is unfortunate. Because compared with most Roman occupations, the life of a keeper of the imperial gardens was remarkably comfortable. Think about it for a moment. The average farmer worked endlessly to produce food. The average soldier marched across dangerous frontiers. The average sailor faced storms and shipwrecks. The average laborer spent his day lifting things that were both heavy and inconveniently located. You spent your day walking through some of the most beautiful gardens in the empire. Not a bad arrangement. The Romans loved gardens. They loved them almost as much as they loved baths, banquets, and discussing how superior Roman civilization happened to be. Wealthy citizens filled their properties with carefully arranged flowers, fountains, statues, shaded pathways, decorative trees, and exotic plants imported from distant provinces. Emperors naturally took this enthusiasm to another level. When an emperor built a garden, it was not merely a garden. It was a statement. Visitors needed to be impressed. Foreign ambassadors needed to be impressed. Political rivals needed to be impressed. Quite often, the emperor himself needed to be impressed. And that responsibility eventually landed on your shoulders. Imagine beginning your morning inside the imperial grounds. Before the city became crowded and noisy, before officials started arguing about politics, before merchants opened their businesses, you were already walking along beautifully maintained pathways inspecting flower beds, fountains, orchards, and decorative landscapes stretching across enormous estates. Most Romans woke up to work. You woke up to scenery. Of course, keeping imperial gardens beautiful required more than simply admiring them. Plants possessed a frustrating tendency to ignore human schedules. Flowers bloomed when they wished. Trees grew where they pleased. Weeds appeared without invitation. Nature, despite centuries of human effort, remained surprisingly independent. This meant your work required expertise. A great deal of expertise. You needed to understand irrigation. You needed to understand seasonal planting. You needed to understand soil, climate, maintenance, and countless varieties of plants collected from across the empire. An exotic tree arriving from a distant province represented prestige. An exotic tree dying shortly afterward represented paperwork. And emperors generally preferred prestige. Visitors constantly moved through the gardens. Senators attended gatherings. Ambassadors walked through shaded paths while discussing diplomacy. Noble families admired decorative landscapes. Scholars enjoyed peaceful surroundings. The gardens became one of the most pleasant environments in Rome. You helped make that possible. There was also something uniquely satisfying about the work. Unlike politicians, you rarely worried about elections. Unlike generals, you rarely worried about invasions. Unlike merchants, you rarely worried about market fluctuations. Your concerns were refreshingly straightforward. Would the flowers bloom? Would the fountains function? Would the gardens look magnificent? Compared with governing an empire, these felt like manageable objectives. And yet your success remained highly visible. A beautiful garden attracted admiration immediately. Visitors noticed healthy trees. They noticed colorful flowers. They noticed elegant designs. Most importantly, they noticed when everything looked exactly as it should. Which meant they rarely thought about how much effort was required to achieve it. A sign of excellent work, perhaps. As the years passed, your reputation grew. Important officials trusted your judgment. Wealthy patrons respected your expertise. Gardeners working beneath your supervision followed your instructions. Few Romans could claim responsibility for maintaining some of the most impressive landscapes in the known world. You could. And unlike many prestigious Roman careers, yours involved remarkably little shouting. At the end of the day, that may be why becoming keeper of the imperial gardens was one of the best jobs in ancient Rome. You enjoyed comfort, respect, stability, and beautiful surroundings while avoiding many of the hardships faced by ordinary citizens. While others spent their lives surrounded by noise, conflict, and endless political ambition, you spent yours among fountains, flowers, shaded pathways, and carefully cultivated beauty. Not a bad way to spend a career. Especially in an empire that could occasionally be rather chaotic everywhere else. Entertainment was serious business in ancient Rome. A governor could manage a province, a general could win a battle, and a senator could deliver a speech, but if thousands of Roman citizens were bored for too long, somebody eventually found himself facing uncomfortable questions. This was why public games mattered so much. They kept crowds happy, celebrated important occasions, displayed Roman wealth and power, and gave citizens something to discuss besides politics. And at the center of all this excitement stood the master of public games. Now, at first glance, organizing massive public spectacles may sound stressful. After all, you were responsible for events attended by thousands of people. Thousands of excited people. History suggests that large groups of excited people occasionally become difficult to manage. Yet compared with many Roman occupations, the position remained remarkably attractive. Think about it for a moment. A soldier worried about enemies. A merchant worried about profits. A farmer worried about weather. You worried about whether the chariot race would start on time. One of these concerns feels considerably more enjoyable than the others. The Romans loved public entertainment. They loved it with an enthusiasm that modern sports fans would immediately recognize. Chariot races attracted enormous crowds. Athletic competitions attracted enormous crowds. Gladiatorial contests attracted enormous crowds. In fact, almost anything capable of gathering a large audience usually attracted enormous crowds. Romans enjoyed being entertained. As master of public games, your responsibility was making sure that entertainment happened successfully. Imagine beginning your morning knowing that tens of thousands of citizens would soon arrive expecting excitement. Not mild excitement. Not moderate excitement. Genuine Roman excitement. The kind involving cheering, shouting, betting, celebrating, arguing, and occasionally behaving as though the future of civilization depended upon the outcome of a race. Human nature has always been remarkably consistent. Fortunately, your position placed you far from the exhausting physical labor that dominated most Roman careers. While ordinary workers prepared venues, maintained facilities, arranged seating, transported equipment, and handled countless practical details, you supervised the operation. You coordinated officials. You reviewed schedules. You managed logistics. Most importantly, you ensured that everything appeared effortless. This is one of history's great professional secrets. When an event succeeds, people assume it was easy. When it fails, everybody suddenly becomes interested in who organized it. Success therefore became your favorite outcome. There were advantages beyond comfort. The position carried prestige. Very visible prestige. A successful merchant might become wealthy. A successful scholar might become respected. A successful master of public games became known by enormous crowds. Every successful festival increased your reputation. Every popular event strengthened your standing. Every celebration provided another opportunity to demonstrate competence. And competence was valuable in Rome. Especially visible competence. Imagine walking through a packed venue while thousands of spectators enjoyed an event you helped organize. Chariots raced. Athletes competed. Musicians performed. Crowds celebrated. Everything unfolded according to plan. At moments like these, it was difficult not to feel a certain satisfaction. After all, people rarely remember the paperwork. They remember the spectacle. The interesting thing was that public games involved much more than entertainment. They were political events. Social events. Cultural events. Victorious generals celebrated triumphs through public ceremonies. Emperors displayed generosity through games. Officials strengthened public support through successful festivals. This meant your work placed you close to power. Very close. Governors, magistrates, wealthy patrons, military leaders, and influential citizens all cared deeply about public events. The better the event, the happier the audience. The happier the audience, the more successful everyone involved appeared. You became a surprisingly important part of that process. Of course, problems occasionally appeared. Crowds could be unpredictable. Weather could be inconvenient. Schedules could collapse. Suppliers could disappoint. Performers could create unexpected difficulties. Large public events have always possessed a remarkable ability to generate small disasters. The secret was ensuring those disasters remained small. Experienced organizers learned to solve problems before most people noticed they existed. If something went wrong, alternatives appeared. If delays occurred, adjustments followed. If difficulties emerged, solutions arrived quickly. At least that was the goal. And compared with marching through hostile territory or surviving Mediterranean storms, these remained relatively civilized challenges. Perhaps the greatest advantage of the profession was the atmosphere itself. Most Roman jobs involved routine. Farming involved routine. Administration involved routine. Military service involved routine. Public games were different. Every event felt alive. Every festival brought energy. Every gathering produced stories. People arrived excited. People departed talking. And you helped create the experience they remembered. That is not a bad legacy. Which is why becoming master of public games was one of the best jobs in ancient Rome. You enjoyed prestige, influence, social connections, and a front-row seat to some of the greatest spectacles in the empire. While others spent their lives working behind the scenes, you helped create the moments entire cities celebrated. And in a civilization that loved entertainment as much as Rome did, that was an extraordinarily fortunate position to hold. Religion was woven into almost every part of life in ancient Rome. Before military campaigns, sacrifices were offered. Before political meetings, omens were consulted. Before major celebrations, prayers were spoken. Gods watched over homes, cities, businesses, families, and nearly every activity Romans considered important. This meant that the individuals responsible for maintaining those sacred relationships occupied a surprisingly comfortable position in Roman society. Those individuals were temple priests. Now, at first glance, becoming a priest may not sound like one of the most exciting careers in the empire. After all, when people imagine ancient Rome, they tend to picture emperors issuing decrees, generals winning battles, senators arguing about politics, and merchants chasing fortunes across the Mediterranean. Very few people imagine a priest beginning his morning by preparing rituals that everyone else considered essential. This is unfortunate. Because compared with most Roman occupations, the life of a temple priest was remarkably pleasant. Think about it for a moment. A farmer worried about drought. A sailor worried about storms. A merchant worried about profits. A soldier worried about enemies. You worried about whether the incense had arrived on time. One of these concerns feels considerably less dangerous than the others. The interesting thing was that Roman religion was not something people visited once a week and then forgot about. It was everywhere. Citizens prayed before journeys. Officials prayed before important decisions. Families prayed during celebrations. Soldiers prayed before battles. Merchants prayed before investments. Whenever Romans wanted success, they generally preferred divine assistance. And if divine assistance was required, priests became very important people. Imagine beginning your day at one of Rome's magnificent temples. The city is slowly waking around you. Merchants are preparing their shops. Laborers are beginning work. Politicians are already thinking about politics. Meanwhile, you walk through towering columns, marble courtyards, sacred statues, and some of the most impressive buildings in the empire. Not a bad workplace. Visitors arrive throughout the day. Some bring offerings. Some seek guidance. Others simply wish to honor the gods. Wealthy nobles appear alongside ordinary citizens. Successful merchants stand beside soldiers. Influential senators share the same sacred space as people whose names history never recorded. The gods, after all, accepted visitors from every level of society. This gave the priest a unique position. Most professions placed you within a particular social group. Farmers worked with farmers. Merchants worked with merchants. Soldiers worked with soldiers. Priests interacted with everyone. And everyone knew where to find you. There was also a certain prestige attached to the role. Romans respected religion. More importantly, powerful Romans respected religion. Emperors sponsored temples. Governors participated in ceremonies. Senators attended important rituals. Public life and religious life were closely connected. This meant your duties often placed you near influential people. Very influential people. Imagine assisting during a major religious festival attended by magistrates, senators, wealthy patrons, and important officials. While ordinary citizens watched from the crowd, you stood at the center of the ceremony. Not because you commanded an army. Not because you possessed enormous wealth. Simply because your role mattered. That is a comfortable form of importance. Of course, being a priest involved responsibility. Rituals needed to be performed correctly. Sacred traditions needed to be maintained. Religious festivals required organization. Offerings required supervision. Temples required management. The gods may have been immortal, but their temples still needed daily attention. Fortunately, compared with most Roman responsibilities, these tasks remained relatively civilized. Nobody expected you to march across hostile territory. Nobody expected you to survive shipwrecks. Nobody expected you to spend 12 hours harvesting crops beneath a blazing sun. Your workplace contained marble floors rather than battlefields. A considerable improvement. Perhaps the greatest advantage of the profession was stability. Empires experienced political change. Governors came and went. Military fortunes rose and fell. Economic conditions shifted constantly. Yet the temples remained. People continued praying. Festivals continued occurring. Religious traditions continued connecting generations. That gave the position a reassuring permanence. While ambitious politicians spent years climbing uncertain career ladders, you occupied a respected role already woven into Roman society itself. Not a bad arrangement. Especially when accompanied by comfortable surroundings, social prestige, influential connections, and meaningful work. Which is why becoming a temple priest was one of the best jobs in ancient Rome. While countless citizens spent their lives struggling against weather, warfare, poverty, and endless physical labor, you spent yours inside some of the most beautiful buildings in the empire, guiding ceremonies, serving your community, and maintaining traditions that Romans believed connected them directly to the gods. And in a civilization where divine favor was considered essential for success, that made you one of the most respected individuals in the city. Messages moved the Roman Empire. Armies depended on messages. Governors depended on messages. Merchants depended on messages. Even emperors, despite ruling one of the largest empires in history, depended on messages. Because an emperor could issue all the orders he wanted from Rome, but those orders remained completely useless until somebody carried them hundreds of miles across the empire. That responsibility belonged to the imperial messenger. The moment you entered the profession, you discovered that your workplace wasn't a building, a city, or even a province. Your workplace was the Roman Empire itself. One morning might begin with an official handing you a sealed dispatch destined for a governor in a distant province. Before the sun had climbed very high, you were already riding along one of Rome's great roads while ordinary citizens settled into another predictable day. Farmers headed toward fields. Craftsmen opened workshops. Merchants arranged goods for sale. Meanwhile, you were carrying information that powerful people were anxiously waiting to receive. There was something satisfying about that. Somewhere ahead, a governor wanted answers. Somewhere behind, an official wanted results. And between them was you, moving steadily across the empire with a message that could influence decisions affecting thousands of people. The longer you remained in the profession, the larger your world became. Most Romans spent their entire lives close to home. They knew their town, perhaps a neighboring town, and little beyond that. You learned roads, provinces, cities, ports, mountain passes, and frontier settlements. Places that sounded distant and mysterious to ordinary citizens became familiar stops along your route. After a few years, you could probably describe parts of the empire more accurately than many senators who spent their lives discussing them. That was one of the unexpected advantages of the job. Every assignment taught you something new. Every journey introduced you to another corner of Rome's enormous territory. Before long, you stopped thinking of the empire as a collection of distant provinces and started thinking of it as a connected network of roads stretching in every direction. And those roads never seemed to rest. Somewhere a military commander needed orders. Somewhere a governor needed instructions. Somewhere an official needed to report developments back to Rome. Information was always moving, which meant you were always moving as well. One journey ended, another began, and before long you realized that while countless Romans spent their lives watching history happen around them, you were often carrying the messages that helped shape it. Wine flowed through ancient Rome almost as reliably as water. Senators drank wine. Merchants drank wine. Soldiers drank wine. Emperors certainly drank wine. A banquet without wine would have seemed incomplete, a celebration without wine would have seemed disappointing, and some Romans appeared genuinely uncertain whether a day could begin properly without at least discussing wine. This meant that producing excellent wine was not merely a business. It was an important responsibility. And at the center of that responsibility stood the chief winemaker. While countless Romans spent their lives performing exhausting labor beneath the Mediterranean sun, you spent your days overseeing one of the empire's most respected and profitable products. Not a bad arrangement. Of course, making wine sounds simple until you actually attempt it. Grapes grow, grapes are harvested, wine appears, and everyone enjoys themselves. At least that was how wealthy Romans preferred to imagine the process. The reality involved careful planning, experience, timing, and enough attention to detail to make even the most disciplined military officer seem relaxed. A single mistake during harvest could affect an entire year's production. Too early and the grapes lacked sweetness. Too late and problems appeared just as quickly. This meant that while other people enjoyed drinking wine, you spent much of your time ensuring there would be good wine worth drinking in the first place. The interesting thing was that wine occupied a unique position in Roman society. Bread was necessary. Olive oil was important. Wine was both practical and prestigious. Ordinary citizens drank it. Wealthy nobles served expensive varieties at banquets. Successful merchants transported it across the Mediterranean. Governors offered it to honored guests. Emperors presented exceptional vintages during celebrations. As chief winemaker, your work connected all these worlds together. A successful harvest might eventually find its way onto the table of a senator in Rome, a wealthy merchant in Alexandria, or a governor entertaining visitors hundreds of miles away. Most Romans never saw the wider journey of the products they consumed. You saw it constantly. And the better your wine became, the more valuable your expertise became. Wealthy landowners paid close attention to successful winemakers. Merchants wanted access to respected vineyards. Important guests asked where particular wines had originated. Before long, your reputation could spread far beyond the estate where you worked. People might never meet you personally, but they knew your wine. They recognized its quality. They trusted its consistency. That trust mattered because Romans loved discussing wine almost as much as they loved drinking it. Give a group of wealthy Romans several cups of wine and before long they would be debating vineyards, harvests, production methods, and vintages with the confidence of men who had personally invented grapes. Fortunately, unlike many professions in the empire, your expertise genuinely deserved respect. A farmer worried about producing enough crops to survive. A soldier worried about surviving long enough to enjoy retirement. A merchant worried about storms, pirates, and investments. You worried about creating something people actively looked forward to consuming. There is a certain satisfaction in that. Every successful harvest represented months of effort rewarded. Every excellent vintage strengthened your reputation. Every banquet serving your wine became a reminder that while armies conquered provinces and politicians argued endlessly about public affairs, some of the most enjoyable moments in Roman life still began with a well-filled cup. The future was a remarkably profitable business in ancient Rome. Generals wanted to know whether campaigns would succeed. Merchants wanted to know whether investments would prosper. Politicians wanted to know whether careers would advance. Wealthy nobles wanted to know whether fortunes would grow. And whenever powerful people started asking questions about the future, somebody eventually suggested consulting an astrologer. This meant that while countless Romans spent their days building roads, harvesting crops, unloading ships, or arguing with tax collectors, you spent your time studying the stars and explaining what they supposedly meant for some of the most influential people in the empire. Not a bad arrangement. Of course, becoming an astrologer to the elite involved much more than standing outside and looking at the night sky. If it were that simple, every shepherd in the empire would have been competing for wealthy clients. The real value came from interpretation. Anybody could see the stars. Your profession required explaining why those stars mattered. A senator preparing for an important political decision wanted guidance. A merchant planning a risky venture wanted reassurance. A noble family arranging a marriage wanted favorable signs. They all arrived with questions, and remarkably, they were often willing to pay generously for answers. The interesting thing was that powerful people rarely become less curious as they become more successful. In many cases, they become more curious. The more wealth a merchant accumulated, the more he worried about protecting it. The more influence a politician gained, the more he wanted to keep it. The higher a noble family climbed, the more interested they became in anything that promised insight into the future. This worked beautifully in your favor. While ordinary Romans worried about tomorrow, your clients worried about years, decades, and entire family legacies. That meant they took astrology very seriously indeed. Before long, your days became filled with fascinating conversations. One morning, a wealthy merchant might arrive seeking guidance before financing a major trading expedition. By afternoon, a senator could be asking questions about an upcoming political opportunity. A few days later, a noblewoman might request an interpretation concerning family affairs. Most Romans spent their lives surrounded by people much like themselves. You spent yours surrounded by some of the richest and most influential individuals in Roman society. Not because you commanded soldiers or owned vast estates, but because they believed you possessed special knowledge. And belief, as it turns out, can be extremely valuable. The longer your reputation grew, the more prestigious your position became. Wealthy clients recommended you to friends. Influential patrons spoke highly of your expertise. Invitations arrived from elegant villas, luxurious banquets, and gatherings attended by people whose names were known throughout the empire. One successful prediction could become the subject of conversation for months. One satisfied client could introduce you to 10 more. Before long, you might discover that your greatest challenge was not finding work but finding enough time to meet everyone requesting your services. There were certainly worse problems to have. Compared with most occupations available in ancient Rome, the advantages were extraordinary. A farmer's success depended on weather. A sailor's success depended on the sea. A soldier's success depended on surviving battle. Your success depended largely on knowledge, reputation, and the ability to remain calm while powerful people asked surprisingly difficult questions about the future. More importantly, your workplace was often a luxurious villa rather than a muddy field, your clients were influential nobles rather than angry customers, and your daily responsibilities involved conversation rather than physical labor. Which is why becoming an astrologer to the elite was one of the most comfortable and intriguing professions in ancient Rome. While